Monty Python would say, now for something really different. In focusing on optimizing ROI, I want to dig a little deeper on that, because what I want to talk about is what you're investing in, not how well you're getting return on it. What are you investing in? And in order to tee that up, I want to start with a cautionary tale about an iconic American company, the Eastman Kodak Company. Eastman Kodak was founded in 1880 by George Eastman, who, by the way, was the inventor of roll film. Pretty good thing to invent. In 1888, they put on the market the very first camera sold to the general public in the U.S., and it totally revolutionized American society. Why? Because up to that point, photography had been a professional business. It took a lot of equipment, a lot of expensive, film and all the rest, and most people couldn't afford it or didn't have the knowledge. When they came on the market with their camera, their pitch line was, you push the button, we do the rest, okay? So all at once it was possible for Americans to memorialize their lives, okay, through what later became known as, right, Kodak moments. Sure. They were phenomenally successful. By 1976, Eastman Kodak Company controlled 90% of the market for film in the United States and 85% of the market for cameras, okay? By 1999, which was at the peak of their financial performance, they had 145,000 employees worldwide. They were looking at revenues of $16 billion a year and profits of $2.5 billion annually, okay? They had one of the 5 most recognized and valued brands in the world, 1990s. Their business model was the razor blade model that was made famous, of course, by Gillette, right? You give away the razors, and then you sell the blades for years after. That was exactly what Kodak did. They made relatively cheap cameras that almost anybody could afford. And then they sold you the film, and of course, you had to print on Kodak paper, right? And it was a money machine. It was a total money machine. Right into the 1990s, their best decade ever. What they missed, however, was that strategy, that business model doesn't work if you're talking about digital photography. And in the 1990s, as digital photography began to become more and more popular, and as other competitors came on the market with digital cameras, Kodak was very slow to react. Very slow. And in fact, after 1999, their market share began to drop, and ultimately the company got into serious financial trouble. Now, that would be a fairly familiar, though unfortunate, story of another company that gets wiped out by an unexpected technology, right? If that were the end of the story. But of course, that's not the end of the story, because the extraordinary thing in this story was that the very technology that ultimately put Kodak out of business was invented by who? Kodak. Back in the early 70s, a fellow named Steve Sasson, who was an electrical engineer in the Kodak labs, and a team of people began to put together electronic components to see if they could project a picture on a screen. And lo and behold, it worked. And in December 1975, they introduced the first digital camera ever made. Here's a picture of Sasson holding it. It was pretty clunky at that point. He knew what he had. The executives at Kodak knew what he had. But guess what? This was going to disrupt the business model. Because if you had digital cameras, you no longer needed film, and you no longer needed paper to print on. And that was where Kodak made its money. Now, their reactions were dressed up with all kinds of formal things, like one Kodak executive famously said, who would ever want to see their pictures on their TV screens, right? But the bottom line was they were looking at their business model. It was working great. In fact, it was going to continue to work pretty great for the next 15 years. And so they turned a blind eye to the technology that they themselves had developed. Now, I don't want to make too much of this analogy, but I think it carries some lessons for the legal industry. Because the fact of the matter is that the legal industry is undergoing some profound changes, and an awful lot of leading law firms are, to be blunt about it, in denial. And I think they're in denial because their business models seem to be working just fine. Of course, the Kodak lesson is the business model works fine right up until the time that it doesn't. Now, Tara was talking about some of the changes in the market. I want to focus on one that I think kind of sums up a lot of them. And that is that since 2008, I would argue that it actually started a little before 2008, but at least since 2008, we have clearly shifted to a buyer's market for legal services. We're no longer in the seller's market that dominated for the 30 years prior to that. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that prior to 2008, all of the essential decisions about how legal services were going to be structured, how they were going to be staffed, how they were going to be delivered, how they were going to be priced, all of those decisions were essentially being made by the law firms. Now, I don't mean that client input didn't matter. I don't mean that clients didn't push back from time to time. But at the end of the day, in most cases, those decisions were being made internally in the law firm as service providers. That clearly is no longer true. As all of you in this room know far better than I, the clients are now in the driver's seat. We are looking at a buyer's market. And what do clients talk about? Clients now want to talk about value. You remember on Tara's chart, value showed the highest increase in conversation topics of anything else. Okay, when clients first started talking about topics, most lawyers I know sort of scratched their heads and said, what on earth are these people talking about? Of course clients want value. Of course they do. But we've always provided value. You know, we're here at Schmidt, Lapp & Jones. Value is what we value, you know? And so what do they mean? Clients mean something very specific. And what clients mean is a focus on efficiency, predictability, and cost effectiveness in the delivery of legal services. That's what value means to a client. Okay, now, if you look at that list, what's missing? Efficiency, predictability, cost effectiveness, what's not there? What's not there? Quality! Quality! It drives lawyers crazy. You mean the clients don't want quality? How could they leave quality off the list? Of course they want quality. But what you have to understand is that quality is the given. Quality is the ante. Quality is the table stakes. It's what you pay to play in this game, okay? At the time you're trying to get your firm on the client's list to provide services in a particular legal specialty, that's where quality comes in. But once you're on the list and it comes time for the general counsel to make a decision about where she is going to send this particular matter, chances are that decision is going to be based on who she believes can deliver most efficiently, predictably, and cost-effectively the services she needs, quality being assumed. Now, is that true in every single matter? Of course not. There will always be the bet the company case. You know, my God, the CEO's been indicted. You know, we've just had this terrible scandal break out on the eve of our IPO, whatever it is. And for those, you will always want the top firm in that field, whatever it is, cost be damned, bring them in, right? But we all also know that that is 3%, maybe, of what lawyers do. Maybe 5% if you're being really generous. But the 95% is increasingly about efficiency, predictability, and cost effectiveness in the delivery of the services. And to get there is going to require a paradigm shift. And I don't use that word lightly because I think we have a lot of, too many paradigm shifts going on our site. But this really does require a paradigm shift in how we think about what we do inside law firms and in what kinds of investments we make, okay? traditionally, if you thought of law firm strategy, you thought of this, the client model. So a law firm had to figure out, okay, what clients are we going to serve? What markets are we going to be in? And what practice areas are we going to have, right? Those were the essential strategy decisions. You got those decisions made, you put the 3-ring notebook up on the shelf, and you didn't look at it again for another 5 years, and then you had another strategy review, right? Today, those are still critical questions. You still got to know those things, and you got to be smart about how you answer them. But you have to have some other stuff too. You've got to think about the service delivery model, okay? What kind of pricing models are we going to have? What kind of work processes? What kind of technological and infrastructure support do we need to serve particular clients in particular markets, in particular practices? And beyond that, what kind of talent model do we need? How do we aggregate the right team, combining forces from within the firm, maybe from outside the firm, maybe involving people in the client's own law department? How do we bring those people together? How do we think about training them? How do we think about outsourcing? All of that stuff. And guess what? The answers to all of those questions about talent and service delivery may change for different clients and different markets and different practices. It's like Tara said, one size doesn't fit all. One size fits one, right? Because how you approach pricing one practice has to be very different from how you approach pricing another. And this again is a sea change, okay? Historically, law firms have always thought about one size fits all. We have one way of pricing, we have one way of staffing, we have one way of leveraging. I was managing partner of Arnold & Porter. I understand this. We had an Arnold & Porter way of litigating, We turned over every rock. We took every deposition. We left no stone unturned, whether the client wanted it or not. The client might come in and say, I'd like to have a Chevrolet. Sorry, we only sell Maseratis. Well, I only want a Chevrolet. Well, we can talk about a discount on a Maserati for you. Or we can sell you 2 Maseratis at a really low price, but you're going to get a Maserati because that's the only way we do things around here, right? That way now that was a long time ago. I'm sure even A&P doesn't do that anymore. But the point is that we have to think differently about how we do all of these things, how we invest in all of these areas. Increasingly, we are seeing that firms that get this idea of where they should be investing, are doing better financially than firms that don't. Now, this is something that we thought we knew intuitively, but it's only been in the last year or so that we've actually begun to be able to put some numbers around it. In the 2015 Altman-Weil survey, which I'm sure you all read, Law Firms in Transition, it was very interesting. They examined firms that had made the kinds of strategic changes we're talking about, and what they saw was that those firms were more likely to have higher increases in their revenues, RPO, and profits than those that did not. And just looking at profits, 77% of firms making changes to lawyer staffing models had increased profits compared to only 56% of those that didn't. 76% improving service delivery compared to 61%, 75% changing pricing models compared to 66% of others. So not shocking, but indications that these changes make a difference. When we saw the Altman-Weil stuff, Georgetown, in connection with Thomson Reuters Peer Monitor, did a more detailed drill down of 34 law firms. These were law firms for whom we had all kinds of financial data, and we did really in-depth surveys where we asked them about 25 different kinds of changes that they could have made in strategy, in pricing, in technology, in client relations, and all kinds of things. And what we found confirmed the same results. So we took those 34 firms, and once we got all the data, we divided them into upper tier firms, that is the top half of the firms in terms of overall financial performance, and the bottom tier firms in terms of overall financial performance. And what we saw was really pretty striking on software. The use of software that allows lawyers to monitor the progress of matters on a real-time basis, 71% of the firms in the upper tier had that. Only 47% of the firms in the lower tier. And so you can see how it goes. Efficient and easily usable knowledge management systems, 71% versus 59%. Skipping down client self-help tools, 29% versus 12%. Use of project management software, 53% versus 35%. And so it went, all right? On outsourcing, use of third-party service providers for non-legal research, 24% versus 6%. You can look at them yourself. I'll provide these slides after. Use of detailed project budgeting model, 76% of the upper tier firms, only 59% of the lower tier, and so forth. So we're beginning to see data, and we're continuing to track this stuff, and we'll continue to report on it. So we're beginning to see data that shows that if you make these changes, it makes a difference. Now, this is a strong argument for investment to your partners, right? If we think it makes a difference, if we can show you that it really makes a difference in financial performance, then supposedly it's a little easier to bite the bullet and make the investment and make the change. So why doesn't everybody do it, right? That's the obvious question. Well, there is a sense in a lot of firms that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and the old model seems to be working fine. If you look at the sort of financial performance of firms since 2008, most firms are doing okay, you know. Not quite as okay as they were before 2008, but most firms are being able to kind of hold it together. So as somebody once said, it's hard to tell a room full of millionaires that their basic business model is wrong, right? And so that's the sort of phenomenon you've got. But remember, of course, that Kodak's business model was working fine in the 1990s too, right? Okay. Unfortunately, I think that this if it ain't broke syndrome is based on a false set of security. Since 2008, law firm performance, which I mentioned has been stable, though a little rocky, has been based essentially on three things. One was the ability to drive expense management quite aggressively. Second, to reduce the ranks of equity partners. And third, to continue to raise rates, albeit at a slower pace than before 2008. I want to suggest that all three of those levers that have allowed us to maintain a semblance of profitability are now in distress. Expense management in firms for the last several years has been about 3%. You can't do much better than that, okay? And in fact, for some investments, you need to spend a little money, right? In terms of equity partner rank reductions, there's not a lot more to be done. We've got a growth in equity partner ranks of about 1% across the profession. We can't screw that down much more, okay? And in terms of rates, we are now seeing signs that the rate increases are harder and harder to get. Realization rates have now fallen to their lowest level in the history of the profession and show no signs of going anywhere except down, all right? So there is considerable evidence that these levers are no longer working, and the current challenge in the market is not that firms are unaware of the threats, it's an unwillingness to shift the models. Like Kodak, we are choosing not to respond to the threat, even though we are presumably aware of its ramifications. And like Kodak, many law firm partners believe that the model is still working, it'll be fine, and besides, I only have 4 more years till I retire, so I've just got to squeeze by a little longer, right? But of course, as we said, the model works fine up until the moment that it doesn't. So the danger is that we're blindsided by short-term success, growing evidence that these trends could negatively impact us in the future, and it remains to be seen whether most firms will be able to avoid these dangers. But what is clear is that the firms that are able to manage to take this more strategic, long-range view and invest in the right things are going to enjoy an enormous competitive advantage, okay? And with that, with 1 second to spare. Okay.